Welcome to Revision 2017. This particular presentation will be about the economics of the 1920s. The interwar years were one of economic upheaval. Particularly well known are the 30s, the hungry 30s, the devil's decades. But the 1920s was a little bit more mixed. Following the end of the First World War, 1918, the economy experienced somewhat of a boom. There was a huge demand for consumer goods, stuff that hadn't been available during the First World War, and certain industries that had been restricted by the government now had free rein. Unemployment was only at 2.6%, and industrial production boosted by 20% by 20% between 1919 and 1921. Clearly, the country had to repair wartime damage, and of course this provided a stimulus to heavy industries such as shipbuilding. But then, 1921, the boom faded away as the conditions which had brought the boom into existence in the first place faded away or went into reverse. The war had meant that Britain had lost many of its traditional overseas markets. It took until 1925 for world trade to return to 1913 levels, and in addition, Britain's share of this trade had fallen from 18 to 11%. Now, the reason for this obviously was because Britain just couldn't supply her customers during the war. In the decade before the First World War, 1/4 of goods manufactured in Britain were exported, so the loss of this export market had a devastating effect on employment. In 1914, Britain had left the gold standard, which had weakened the pound as a trading currency and damaged London as a financial centre, in addition to the fact that there was a war on. Staple industries suffered the worst as other countries during the 20s imposed tariffs to protect their own industries, and also as a consequence of outdated machinery, poor industrial relations and restrictive practices. Now, clearly, during the war, the most important thing was to win the war. So a lot of industries, such as mining, for example, were just really worked to death. There was very little investment, and the emphasis was getting as much coal as possible out of the ground in order to fuel the industries that needed to produce armaments, and of course, in order to fuel the navy. Industrial relations were poor, as we'll see later on, leading to strikes, a lot of strikes going on, in spite of Lloyd George's efforts to keep them to a minimum. The decline of the staple industries led to high structural unemployment, which affected 17% of the workforce by June 1921. There's some debate about this. I think S.J. Lee says this comes as far as 21%. But certainly, most of this unemployment was seen in the staple industries, the shipbuilding, the coal, the iron, the textiles, that kind of thing. And rising unemployment increased industrial disputes. 86 million days were lost through strikes in 1921 compared to 35 million in 1919. The most depressed areas, of course, were Glasgow, Belfast, around Manchester, Liverpool, Sunderland, Newcastle, and of course South Wales and Cardiff and Newport. British trade was hit by millions of tonnes of shipping being sunk and the loss of overseas markets. Britain lost her textile markets in India and China, who developed their own, and this damaged the textile industry in Lancashire. British coal exports never recovered their pre-war levels. Countries either developed their own industries or they sought to import coal from places like Poland. Wartime capital expenditure of Britain and her empire was greater than other participants. She was left with huge debts, especially to the USA, because debtors to us, to Britain, such as Russia, failed to pay up. They'd had a revolution and decided not to pay any debts that the previous government had incurred. The USA was particularly recalcitrant and required payment in full at once. Now, there'd been overinvestment in the staple industries, iron, steel, ships, coal and textiles, during the war. These were the industries that were needed to produce war, armaments, that kind of stuff. But these kind of goods were no longer required in peacetime, and these industries lost their pre-war primacy and entered a period of slow decline. The shipping industry was also hit, a double whammy you could say, by the fact that the trade was declining because, of course, the trade was carried in ships and there was no need for these ships to be built any longer because there wasn't too much trade going on. In addition, coal also lost its primacy because not only was it not needed to make the steel to build the ships, it was no longer needed to power these particular ships. And increasingly, electricity was taking the place of coal, even in the home, for heating and such like. This short-term post-war boom, as we said, they were replacing the ships that had been sunk, that kind of thing, but it also brought with it inflation, as interest rates were raised, and then suddenly things went downhill into depression. Unemployment rose from 300,000 to over 1 million, and then by 21 a crisis figure of 2 million was reached. Now, as I said, these figures vary, but so long as you realise that they're almost doubling within a year, you can understand that there was a particular crisis at this time. Unemployment is particularly associated with the interwar years. Lloyd George had extended the 1911 unemployment insurance scheme in 1920. Now, as you remember, the initial legislation provided for just 3 trades: building, engineering, shipbuilding. The 1920 Insurance Act provided benefits for all workers covered by the 1911 Health Insurance Act, provided they earned less than £5 a week. This extended the insurance cover to about 12 million workers, and they were entitled to 15 shillings a week for 15 weeks in 1 year. By 1921, there was an extension to this legislation to include benefits for those uncovenanted, that is, a period of insurance they hadn't paid for, provided they were genuinely seeking work. And extra payments were also made to dependents, 5 shillings for a wife, a shilling for each child. Now, the main success of this legislation were that unemployment insurance was so extensive that it cut across the poor law authorities, moving the responsibility from local to central government. As unemployment continued to be a problem, this insurance payment took the sting out of discontent and probably prevented quite a number of strikes and rebellions. And insurance payments were not perceived to be as humiliating as the poor law. So people who were receiving these benefits didn't feel as though they were second-class citizens. By 1925, the Unemployment Insurance Act benefit could be claimed not just for 2 16-week periods, but indefinitely, providing the worker was genuinely seeking work. Lovely little graph here showing the unemployment as it goes up and down, and you can see the huge jump at the beginning of the 1920s. Now, the usual explanation for this pattern of unemployment is that it was partly cyclical. Now, cyclical means that it's relating to world conditions. In other words, what's going on at the time, is there a boom, is there a bust, that kind of stuff. And then it was partly structural, relating to the particular problems of the staple industries, as we've seen previously, the coal and the building and that kind of stuff. Now, D.H. Aldcroft really emphasises the structural nature of unemployment, and he says, prior to 1939, the chief problem of the northern regions and Wales was their heavy dependence on a small group of staple industries, the markets for whose products virtually collapsed, largely, though not entirely, as a result of the severe deterioration of the export trade. The main difficulty lay in the excessive reliance on this narrow industrial basis. Well, there's some statistical support for his view. Between 1920 and 1938, the employment within the staple industries fell by over 1 million. The number of coal miners was reduced from 1.08 million to 0.68 million. Same kind of decline exists also in iron and steel and shipbuilding. Now overall, it's been estimated that 50% of Britain's unemployed had been made redundant by the staple industries. By 1932, 35% of miners were unemployed, 31% of textile workers, 48% of steel workers, and 62% shipbuilding workers. The causes of the general strike were both long-term, medium-term and short-term. In the long term, mining was a notoriously dangerous industry. Accidents, cave-ins, gas, poor health. And the mines themselves hadn't really been invested in for a very long time. The majority of mines were old, small. Most coal was still cut by hand, and it lacked capital investment. Of course, the war had made this worse because the main emphasis was on getting out as much coal as possible rather than on investing in things like machines to cut the coal faster. What coal owners tended to do was to employ more workers because it was cheaper to do that in order to raise productivity than it was to buy machinery to improve productivity. It was in the mines that the unions had the most success. Now, before the war, 1 in 10 of all male workers was employed in the coal mining. So therefore, you can see that coal was a really important industry. It was the backbone of the economy. As I said, it provided the fuel for factories, it provided huge exports, it provided fuel for the home, and so on and so forth. It was very much seen as a barometer for industrial relations. In a depression, it was the coal industry that was the first to experience wage cuts, and then other industries would follow on. The miners were unionised. In 1889, the Miners' Federation was formed and became the strongest union. And it was the mining unions that sponsored some of the first working class MPs, such as Keir Hardie. The mining union joined with the transport and railwaymen to form a triple alliance before the First World War. And they had promised to support each other in sympathetic strike action should the need arise. Now, following the end of the war, there was a decline in coal exports. From 1919, exports fell because of foreign competition, although there was a slight recovery in 1923-24 because the French had occupied the Ruhr area of Germany. It didn't last very long, however. And what happens is that the major importers of British coal, such as France, Scandinavia, Italy, Germany, South America, Russia, they all bought less British coal. The only major importer that bought more was Belgium. Now in 1920, the Emergency Powers Act was passed by Parliament and allowed the government to use troops to distribute coal or whatever else in case of a strike. Now, in case of a strike by the coal miners, but also in case of a strike by the transports, remember that triple alliance. Now, the mines were due to go back to private ownership, and the miners were getting quite angsty about this, and as a miners' strike was in the offing in 1920, the government employed a delaying tactic and negotiated a temporary 6-month pay rise. Now, 1921, the mines returned to the original private owners after this wartime nationalisation. Owners called for wage cuts and a return to local bargaining. The miners refused and were locked out. On Black Friday, that's April 1921, the Triple Alliance withdrew its support for the miners' strike, leaving them exposed. So the miners' lockout lasted until June, and they were forced to accept wage cuts. Other unions were forced to accept wage cuts, and there was a lockout of engineering employees to enforce a policy of unlimited overtime. So what about these short-term pressures that bring about the general strike? Well, 1925, they went back on the gold standard. The consequences of the general strike seem to be very negative for the working classes, for the trade unions. The miners particularly, although they struggled on until November 1926, they were eventually forced back to work, and they were on lower pay scales. They were embittered, potentially the most radical. The owners were unrepentant, they deliberately picked on miners that had been on strike and that kind of thing. Now, Baldwin passed the Trade Disputes Act, which declared illegal any sympathetic strike and made it necessary for trade union members to authorise personally any political levy made on their behalf. They had to opt in rather than opt out. What that did was it had quite a deleterious effect on the Labour Party. The membership of trade unions fell as well, and there were also fewer strikes as trade union leaders tried to avoid further conflicts with their government and with employers. Having said that, there were some positives from this. There was an increased tendency to negotiate rather than gwrthdaro. I don't know what gwrthdaro is in English. Conflict, that's it, conflict. So we see people like Alfred Mond, who's the head of ICI, saying, "We realise that industrial reconstruction can be undertaken only in conjunction with and with the cooperation of those entitled to speak for organised labour." So in other words, what he was saying was that he, as the head of ICI, was quite willing to negotiate with the unions. Employers became more aware of the need for a degree of conciliation, and paradoxically, the general strike reduced class antagonism. The middle classes became more aware of what manual work meant when they'd carried out voluntary duties during the course of May 1926. And A.G.P. Taylor said, "The general strike, apparently the clearest display of the class war in British history, marked the moment when class war ceased to shape the pattern of British industrial relations." Now, it also had a kind of strange political importance as well. Although the government had scored a victory against organised labour, in fact, the passing of the Trades Dispute Act led to a lot of people turning against Baldwin. It was particularly vindictive. And the governments, therefore, found themselves losing by-elections, and Labour was gaining seats as a result. Churchill, once again, showed how particularly vindictive that he could be, once again wanting you to use tanks and live ammunition against strikers. The Labour Party gained not only seats and support, but many who had previously wanted direct action with the TUC now opted for political action through the Labour Party, and this showed in the vastly increased support for Labour in the 1929 election. For the first time in its history, Labour became the largest party in Parliament, 288 seats, and it was a kind of turning point for Labour in its political history. Now, we've tended to sort of concentrate on the negative aspect of the 1920s. Were there any positive economic developments? Well, there were some encouraging signs of growth by the end of the decade, and after 1925, there were signs of stability and recovery. New light industries, chemicals, electrical goods, canned foods, cars, they all grew rapidly. The development of the national grid from 1926 brought a more flexible form of power to industrial and domestic users, giving new industries greater flexibility of location. So instead of having to be near the coal fields in order to power their factories, they could locate in the Midlands, in the southeast, because of course electricity could be brought to them. Now, of course, the electricity had a negative effect on much of the coal mines, because fewer people then were spending on coal as domestic fuel, and of course electricity and so on were being used to power factories, thus once again decreasing the call for coal. Productivity as a whole during this period increased. More stuff was being produced. Overall, economic growth was faster between 24 and 29 than it was before 1914, before the war. And the service sector, retail, entertainment, administration, these grew, creating 1 million new jobs by 1929. Living standards improved for most people generally during the 1920s. Here we have a précis of the different economics policies pursued by the different governments during the 1920s. All governments recognised the structural, the basic problems of British economy, but none of them managed to find a lasting solution to overcome the difficulties experienced in the most depressed areas, even though they tried a variety of different measures. Now, this is true of all the countries in the world at this time. Britain wasn't any different. However, compared to America, Britain did have a problem. America during the 20s experienced a boom. Britain did not. Now, this, of course, is mainly due to the war, because Britain didn't invest and, of course, found that she was overworking the industries and almost becoming too specialised in sort of war industries, really. Whereas America, got to remember as well that America has got most of her raw materials on site, so to speak. Britain, of course, had to import, which during the war was becoming increasingly difficult. So the coalition government following the war passed the Insurance Act, as I've said before, to extend the 1911 scheme. The Conservatives wanted tariff reform, but this solution, in other words, we were going to put import duties on things coming from other countries so as to protect our industries, it was rejected by the 1923 election. Now, Labour in 1924 attempts to launch a public works schemes for roads and housing. In other words, they're trying to employ people doing these kind of work in order to solve the problem of unemployment and improve the infrastructure. But of course, before they could make any progress on that, they were out of office. They were in office only for a few months. The Conservatives, of course, restored to the gold standard. Very limited impact on the financial system, worsened Britain's export situation. The average cost of exports rose by 10%. And they did try a number of subsidies to certain industries, such as Imperial Airways. But really, it's not quite the too little too late of the 1930s, but it's more a wait-and-see attitude of the governments during this time. They're not proactive, they're just seeing what's going to happen. So by the end of the decade, there's some signs of recovery, but there's no growth in Britain compared to that we see in America. High unemployment persisted, and the depressed regions found no solution to their structural problems. On the whole, the economy of the 1920s was disappointing. The British economy, strangely, recovered from the Depression quickly and more completely than that of her industrial rivals, probably because of a relatively poor economic performance in the 1920s. The rate of economic growth during the 20s had not outstripped Britain's industrial and economic strength. In other words, the British economy was closer to rock bottom than the economies of its rivals, like America. So therefore, they had further to fall. Britain was also lucky in that she didn't experienced the speculation on the stock market, which of course had been a huge traumatic experience in the US and in Germany. And in many ways, in the 1930s, although it's called the Devil's Decade and so on, the British economy actually rallied during this time and revived. And the revival was essentially domestic based, as we'll see when we look for 1930s later.